So I'll say thank you for sitting down with me. So you play a bit of a different role as a Secretary of State candidate because you have to set a certain threshold for your party.
That's correct.
There's a bit of extra responsibility that comes as the Libertarian candidate for you. Talk a little bit about how you approach that responsibility.
Well, since 1994, the Libertarian Party has met the 2% threshold in the Secretary of State's race. So I'm really looking at it from a different perspective, and that is we have the word out. We have enough people who vote straight ticket Libertarian to get that 2%. But that 10%, if I get 10% or over of the vote, then that means the Libertarian Party is in the primaries. And it's a wonderful thing for a political party to get that, because when you vote in a primary, you choose Republican and Democrat right now. It'd be great for people who support us, who'll start picking the Libertarian ballot, and to learn who those people are. It's a big milestone, and it'd be another step where we don't have to deal with the advantages of the Republicans and Democrats, and we can play on a more equal footing with them. So that's one thing I'm doing, is I'm working very hard to get that 10%. I was polling 10% in May. Secretary of State doesn't get a lot of polls. I think there'll be one that'll come out soon from the rumors that I hear. It'll be very interesting to see where I'm at that point in time.
When you talk about trying to get to that 10% threshold, that would be a pretty big jump for any Libertarian candidate in this state. They're usually around the 5 or 6% mark. What's your strategy like to get the word out about this is why you need to vote for a party that's sometimes overlooked?
Well, the strategy is basically what I'm all about, why I'm running for Indiana Secretary of State, and it's also a very libertarian reason to run for Indiana Secretary of State, and that is many, many people who are libertarians are small business owners. And what we represent, I think, best is small business owners. The Secretary of State's office has a unique position where it deals with business all the time. And it should be a more aggressive advocate for small business. One of the things I'm going to do when elected is have a small business advisory council of employees, small business owners, contractors, consumers, contractors, to advise me on how government is hurting business, and on the converse, sometimes it is good for business. But it's got to be good in a fair and equal way for business, and especially small business, which there really doesn't seem to be a huge advocate in government for that right now. It's the big business that gets advocates. Attorney General deals with consumers. Well, what about small business? They're the backbone of Indiana. It's 45–50% of everybody employed here in Indiana works for a small business. It needs an advocate. So that's how I'm approaching it, and that's just very important that somebody is there. I'm getting that message out, and a lot of people are listening. I talk a lot about small business. There are other issues as well.
I feel like the Business Services Division of the Secretary of State's office is one that doesn't get a lot of publicity, doesn't get talked about very much. The one that does, obviously, is the Chief Election Officer kind of role. So you mentioned your sort of stance on how you'd like to see the business side of that office transformed a little bit.
Yes.
I want to talk about, as a Chief Election Officer, what do you feel that Indiana isn't doing that you would do differently?
Well, the voting security is a horrible thing. We're not even close to what banks do, what big companies do, small companies do in security. Small companies have better security than the voting systems in Indiana. It's not getting the attention it needs. And that's awful, because the first thing that government does to be respected is have voting systems that people trust. If you don't trust, things don't go well for a country or for a state. And that's a very, very bad thing. We have no backup system paper right now. Why do you have a paper backup system now? Because the electronic system is not secure enough. We had allegations of a couple years ago that the Russians were just kind of meddling around, or somebody with Russian ties were. And that tells me that we're nowhere near where we need to be able to have what is a modern 2018 system in the rest of the world when it comes to businesses. But for Indiana and for the government, it's doing what government does so often. It's putting its money elsewhere, and it's not doing it for priority number one, which is that the succession of elected officials and the selection of elected officials is the very first thing it must do, and it must do well. And it must have voting systems to do that, and that takes putting the priorities towards money to do that. Just throwing money at it doesn't let alone do it. It's got to be wise and with thought and with the very best to do that. And that's not happening right now.
You talk again about that idea of money, and Secretary Lawson, all the states got money from the federal government this cycle to beef up election security. Indiana's spent and spending that money already, but one of the things it won't be able to do is provide paper backups for all of the counties across the state. Some will have them, some do not. Besides that, what else would you do to help guarantee election security in Indiana?
Well, one thing is getting better electronic systems. The systems are not up to par. And the system that they have with the approval of the Indiana Election Commission is not approving. First of all, I don't think it's getting the requests for proposals which go out. I don't see the type of companies that need to be doing that, not knocking the companies now, because they're doing it from a fair market position, which is this is what they want, this is what we can afford to do to give them what they want and make it a decent living off of it. You've got to put a lot more effort into it, and you've got to go out and find the very best, not do what we normally do in state government, which is try to get cheap and have qualifications that for political reasons you're not looking for the best. Elections are number one. Why isn't the office, the General Assembly, treating it that way? We need to get the same systems that banks have across the nation to make sure that their systems are as secure as possible. No system can be 100% secure. I'm very realistic and pragmatic about that. But you've got to make it so that it's extremely difficult, and we're not doing that right now in Indiana.
As Hoosiers go to the polls starting tomorrow, as a matter of fact, with early voting,
yes.
And certainly on Election Day itself, given the criticisms you and others, including Mr. Harper, the Democratic candidate, have sort of lobbed at what Secretary Lawson has done or hasn't done on election security, along with the General Assembly, should Hoosiers be worried about their votes and whether or not they're secure when they cast their ballots?
They should be worried about their votes and casting their ballots. You never know when what I would use the term meltdown happens. You don't know who's doing what. We know that there are people who have always done this. If you study history, historians know this. Countries have been delving into other countries' businesses for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So you need to be ahead of it and have the systems to counter that, and it's just not happening right now. If you have a paper backup, if you have a way to go back and say this person actually voted for these, cast this ballot, then that's a way to be able to double check to make sure things are going well and that there's security. In a modern age, the government should, in 2018, have these systems already. The systems, in my opinion, are out there. They're just not doing it. They're not, for lots of reasons, they're not doing it, and they need to do so.
Aside from election security, there's also issues of election reform that have been bubbling up in Indiana for more than just the last year or couple of years, particularly from the Democratic Party, but quite frankly on a bipartisan, in the legislature at least, Republicans and Democrats, and from the Libertarian Party as well, advocating some sort of the outside, if you will. The Secretary of State oversees elections.
Yes.
Should the Secretary of State also be playing a role in advocating for election reforms like independent redistricting?
Yes. And the reason for that is that as the chief election officer, you're a constitutional officer. That's very important under the Indiana Constitution. And you have the role of being chief election officer. You should be advocating for it. You're in the best position if you pay attention to what's going on and what's working and what's not working. And you, as Secretary of State, if you're paying attention, you should be telling the General Assembly what's working and what's not working. It should be the #1 advocate for election reform. And we do need election reform. We need it on gerrymandering and redistricting, where it's not politicians picking the voters, it's voters picking the politicians. Gerrymandering prevents that. We need to have somebody there going, this needs to change. And be right. To me, you just need to be very, very radical is a word that comes to mind. By that I mean you have to push it, and you have to be the advocate. You have to be the person that says this needs to change and here's why. You also have to be able to work with other people. And I'm chairman of the Indiana Public Defender Commission. I'm an other, which means I'm not a Republican and I'm appointee of the governor. I'm not a Democrat, I'm a Libertarian. And I have to work with Republicans and Democrats on that commission to get things done. And I'm very proud to say that in my 11 years as chairman of that commission, we've accomplished quite a bit. And part of it is because I and others on the commission all will work together for common goals. I can do that. Why can't I do that as Secretary of State? I can work with the General Assembly and make sure that we find the common goals to get to where we need to have secure systems, to get rid of gerrymandering, and to have elections where people can trust them and think, well, yeah, I'm making a difference by voting.
Are there any other things, obviously you've mentioned gerrymandering, obviously the election security side. What other election reforms would you like to see Indiana kind of take part in?
Well, one of them is that I like to joke, but it's really not a joke, that we have a great election code for 1870. It needs to be modernized. It has too many questions on it, and the approach you need to have is, what are your key principles, which I believe don't change over time very much, if at all, but then what are the practical considerations? We no longer do a horse and buggy or a horse to the courthouse. There's no need to make sure everybody's together on the same day to make sure that we have only the people who should be voting. You can have voting in other ways that other states are experimenting with. Early voting should be more convenient. Why should we just have one day? Why should it be just 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock? When that's not the way this world works anymore, especially here in Indiana. Those hours keep people from voting. It's easier to absentee vote than it used to be, but still, that's a hassle. Why can't there be more time, more early voting centers? Those are reforms that are desperately needed. We need reforms in campaign finance. If you look at the rules of filing, it's confusing. County clerks are confused what the rules mean, and they apply different rules. The Indiana Election Division, they have good people there who try to help you with it, but they're not your lawyers, and they run across these issues as well. And we really need to make everything clear. And the thing that irks me the most about our campaign finance system, there are lots of things, but one that's really top there right now is, depending on the office you're running for, depends on when your filing deadlines happen to be. That's confusing. Everybody's going, okay, I'm running for state representative. Do I file on Thursday or do I file on next Tuesday? I'm running for statewide office. Do I file on Thursday? Do I file on next Tuesday? That's a system for problems, and it's a system designed to trap the unwary, and it also keeps normal people from voting. I was at a commission meeting many, many years ago, and a person who had run for state representative, he was being fined for not filing paperwork on time for campaign finance reform. You could tell by the gentleman that he was a nice gentleman, probably hardworking. He probably just ran to make a point, to have a podium, which is fine. We need more of that. We need more fresh ideas in the system. But it was clearly a low-budget campaign, but he just didn't understand the complex 150 pages of campaign finance guidance and rules that are out there. And he went and made his case before the commission, Indiana Election Commission, and they reduced the fine tremendously because they probably saw that he didn't understand it and he meant no harm by filing late. But as he walked away, he summed up everything. And what he said was, well, I learned my lesson here. People like me should not run for office. And my thought was, people like him should run for office, and they should be the people we're electing. And if you have a system that prevents people who have normal jobs, normal workday, they worry about paying the mortgage, sending the kids to trade school or college, making sure they have enough food to eat, that they have a decent home, those are the people you really want there. They're the common sense people. They're the people, actually, from what a lot of people say, are making the best decisions, taking care of themselves first. You don't want to have a system that prohibits that. It should be as easy for people to run, and that includes making ballot access easier. Libertarian Party has met that 2% threshold, but since 1994 I've seen many, many parties, some of which have ballot access in other states, fail to get on Indiana's ballot. It tells you it's a tough one to get on, and it shouldn't be that way. I remember California when they had a special election for governor, and the decision was there was no limit to who could run. There was like 100 people on the ballot, but guess what? Maybe 3 to 5 got a significant number of votes, which proves my point. The voters were smart enough to figure it out.
Those are the issues I sort of wanted to talk about in this race, but is there an issue that you don't think is being talked about enough in the Secretary of State's race?
Yes, there's one issue especially, and I don't think enough emphasis is given to the fact that the Secretary of State is responsible for securities law enforcement in Indiana, especially under Indiana law. And a complaint I get from lots of attorneys, lots of people in smaller and mid-sized counties is that there are no resources or help from the Secretary of State's office or anywhere for their law enforcement, for their prosecutors to learn and be able to do securities fraud cases, which are criminal. The way the system works is there's just not enough resources out there when there should be, and it really isn't that difficult to do. The Secretary of State's office can find ways to get support for the law enforcement, for prosecutors, in ways of how to try a case, how to investigate a case. Because unlike, let's say, a city the size of Indianapolis, which is large enough to be able to have people who specialize in that, they need help doing that, because from a legal standpoint, paper cases, which are usually securities fraud cases, are the hardest ones to prove. You have to take all this paper and put it together and explain what it means. Prosecuting somebody for battery is relatively easy for a lawyer who's a litigator. And it's basically, sir, did somebody hit you? Yes, that person did. Hit me in the face and I had a black eye. That is the basics for the case, but it's way more difficult for securities fraud. Why is that important? It's important because if you've worked all your life to save $100,000, that might as well be 10 million to 100 million to you. Yet it seems like the cases that get attention are those that are larger like that. And that's not the way it should be. In fact, those are important cases to prosecute as well, but the smaller ones are just as important, because you devastate a person's life usually near the end of their life, and you do nothing about trying to stop it or trying to prosecute those who take advantage of people.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me.
All right, well, thank you.